The goal of Data Transformers podcast is to accelerate digital transformation by bridging the gap between business outcomes and rapidly advancing technologies. And we aim to bridge this gap by focusing on data. I am Peggy Tsai, top 50 women in tech influencer, co-author of the AI book, and data governance expert.
I'm Ramesh Danta, an entrepreneur, a tech blogger, and AI enthusiast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Data Transformers. I'm pleased to have Fionn Lee Madan with us today. She's the co-founder and COO at Fairly AI. And for those of you who listened before, we've actually featured the CEO of Fairly AI, which is a governance and audit platform for AI systems. Welcome, Fionn, today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Fionn.
Thank you.
I know we talked about this, but maybe for, just for the audience who are listening, really about the inequality gaps that we see. It's really, from what my perspective, spurred on by the fact of, poor data or lack of data in a lot of these models that are affecting these results. So how do you see it from a technology perspective? Because you are, I mean, you see yourself as a technologist. How can technology help to solve and close the gaps when it comes to inequality?
Yeah, so I think you're right, like especially around machine learning, right? Like data is like 80% of the problem.
Yes.
So like having like technology to even like prep the data before you begin machine learning training is one area we are certainly looking at, right? And I know a lot of businesses are looking at that too. The other way is just to do what we call like an audit, right? Using technology to do an audit of your actual AI and algorithm and all the outputs from those machine learning models. That's how another way technology can help. There's a lot of talk also about, I think going back to data though, one of the reason why like there's the bias in data is because a lot of low income people are not as trusted to give their data to, I guess, all these online apps, or like they may not even have access to online applications. Like when I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, one of the things I was surprised about is that we don't use email to communicate to parents because some parents may not have internet at home, and we still use paper forms. And like I was shocked because here in Canada, in Toronto, everything's through email now. Like, oh, all right, so there's that. I think they fixed the problem. Like now Cambridge offer like free internet for the whole city, basically. So they have that ability to do that. But yeah, going back to data, like a lot of biases because like traditionally either the minority data or people who don't have access to internet, like you can't collect data if like people are not online, basically, right? And none of the data we gather are on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and all that stuff. And I think if you look at at least the last time I looked at the stat, right, like is the younger, more affluent population that are using Twitter and Facebook. Not so much the older generation or people who are in the lower income categories. So I think that's why like a lot of data, especially like social listening type of data, bias.
That's right, actually. Yeah. So one of the areas, Fionn, we wanted to ask you is this. Okay, so the AI ethics is a very broad area, right? So you could talk about, like we heard instances of in UK, there was this they try to identify the students who are more likely to be successful, in the tests or things. There was a controversy that happened last year. And then you hear about other issues of the mortgage lending where certain minorities and women were excluded when this whole the PPP, the payment loan, disaster loans came into being in COVID, right? So, and then people get rejected, as Peggy mentioned, for credit worthiness. So, which of these areas is Fairly AI targeting?
So we are building our technology to be horizontal, meaning like we want to be able to help across all these use cases that you just spoke of. But our initial go-to-market is in financial services, because what we find is that ultimately, like financial services is the most AI ready industry, because they have been using data for decades now, and that they have the most money, so they are the early adopter of AI. They are able to spend the money to experiment with AI, right? So that's why our initial go-to-market is the financial services, and especially around credit lending use cases, for the ethical use of AI. But there's actually a lot of interest in the capital side as well, like in the capital markets, even though there's no like personal information, it's all institutional, stock trading stuff. But because they are in regulated industry, they are actually thinking of using like the Fairly technology to help do some model risk management and validation as well. So we have broadened our scope a little bit to include that in our current product strategy.
Yeah, I mean, there's, I think when we first looked at Fairly AI, there's certainly a correlation, right, between regulated industries that need to document how they come up with their models, and then what your product, Fairly AI, can do is to provide that audit trail and also collaboration between amongst the data science team.
So, Fionn, you mentioned in the past about, I read somewhere your post, or I heard you somewhere, where you're comparing the artificial intelligence, the state of AI right now, to the state of e-commerce about, whatever, 15, 20 years ago, right? In terms of the terminology itself is getting set. Not everybody on the same page what a particular terminology means, whether it's AI, ML. Sometimes we even argue AI, ML, the same thing or the different things. So I would like to get your perspective on what you mean by the state of AI right now in the industry is the same as 15 years ago, whatever, 20 years ago, and it most likely will go through the same evolution that the e-commerce industry has gone through.
Yeah, definitely. So that's another reason why I love joining David on this journey, is because I see a lot of parallel between the AI space and the early e-commerce days. One of the things is like build versus buy. I'm in product. Well, one of my roles is in product marketing, so there's a lot of, things I learned there. That one of the biggest pain points right now for marketers and a salesperson is to convince the customer it's better to buy versus build it in-house. So I see a lot of that conversation going on in the AI space right now.
Okay.
And then the other one is a lot of the tools that are being developed for AI are like DevOps. Well, in the e-commerce world, it's called DevOps tools, but in the AI world, it's like your model ops or your ML ops tools right now that's being built, but not a lot of tools being built on the analytical side. That's coming later. So like if you look at the evolution of e-commerce, eventually you have your web analytics tools that are built for the business users so that they can understand how their e-commerce traffic's doing, the conversion rate and all that stuff. I don't see any of that in the AI space right now. In fact, I have been thinking and coining the term model analytics. That's like the next big thing, next frontier that I think will be because like when you look at ML ops and model ops, it's all very reactive and it's all very tactical, I would say. Like you're trying to debug something because there's a fire in production, like suddenly your performance drop and you have to figure out why. Versus like an analytical tool is more proactive and more strategic, I would say. You're looking at the bigger picture. So it's more for the business decision makers. And there's honestly not a lot of tools out there that are built for business decision makers to understand AI at this point. And that's certainly something we want to do.
Actually, digging a little bit deep into that, couple of guests that we had, on our show so far, Dr. Bonnie Holub comes to my mind, and then there's a gentleman called Shailendra from Singapore. So one of the things that they mentioned along the lines you're talking about is that nowadays we build solutions in AI towards a problem, right? So that means you pick a model and then you train the model with the data, and then you inference, to solve certain analytics problems. But now what if the model has to be updated? It's now again, it's completely restart a project towards modernization of the models itself, or you use a different model, right? So instead, so there's a plug and play concept that is coming into being towards what you're probably saying, which is that, you separate the model from the data and then you pick the model, as opposed to completely building a new solution, because that is a big challenge for companies that they're going through. I think looks like what you're saying is something related to that one, isn't it? That way you're more proactive about it to solve the problem. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think what you brought up is another, I don't think it's exactly what I was saying. Like, I've certainly seen a lot of, not a lot, like a few, what they call like model marketplace, where you can just
exactly
buy a model and then like plug in your data, and then like, if it doesn't work, then you use a different model. So I see a lot of that. I think what I'm coming from is just a way for business users to understand what the data scientists are doing and what these models are doing, because there's still that gap in between how data scientists communicate with the business decision makers. And ultimately, it's the business decision makers that have to approve these AI systems to, to be built and to go to production. So
explainable AI, right? Another term that's coming onto the horizon.
Okay, so don't get me started on explainable AI.
I'll not go there. Okay, Peggy, over to you. Otherwise, we could just go down this rabbit hole.
Because I do want to say something. So there's a lot of talk about explainable AI, but when you really dive deep into it, right now, explainable AI are just debugging tools for data scientists. They're not what I think a regular citizen in the world want explainable AI to be.
Yeah.
Well, you bring up a great point, Fiona. I mean, I think, and we see this again, we hear it from a lot of other speakers, the fact that data scientists have problems explaining the results to their business counterparts. And there's like that chasm, that communication gap, as you said, between, okay, this is what the business is saying, and then data scientists can build their model, but who knows if they're actually building it correctly, but then the results not always get explained to business. So we see that as a data literacy, challenge. So that's almost, again, something technology cannot fix, unfortunately, but it's just teams of people need to work together. So maybe that analytics ops solution that you're going to build in the future can help. Because for the most part, business people do not understand data science concepts. So what do you suggest? I mean, to help narrow that gap a little bit?
So I think ultimately business decision maker make decision based on ROI, right? So I think there's that piece that's missing in the model building right now. In fact, I think one of the points made by Timid Gabu, the Google data scientist
she was let go.
Yeah. So her paper specifically called out how much energy training these models were using, and it's bad for the environments. So I think that part is actually very critical part that a lot of business users do not understand. It actually costs money to train these models. So is it worth it for you to keep training a model to get the 0.001% more accuracy? I think that's the type of decision making that like business users need to understand, versus a data scientist. Oh, they love training models, or they'll just keep training if like cost isn't an issue, right? So I think that's something we can certainly help bring to the table from an analytics point of view.
Actually, the same argument is also being used against cryptocurrency, right? To mine the cryptocurrencies, right? So then you are using so much energy power. At the end of the day, it's not worth it.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. So along these lines, so Fiona, if let's say within the AI, from your perspective, if you have a keynote speech, what do you think are the challenges that need to be addressed right now? First, let's speak it from an organization's perspective, right? So Peggy brought up this data literacy aspect. So there are different companies at a different maturity area, right? So some of the companies are in very early stages of what the technology is, how we can use it, right? So from an organization's perspective, what are the priorities again, talking about AI, not the broad technology that the companies should focus on?
Like, I feel like for industry that are not even using a lot of data at this point, they certainly have a bigger gap to jump through before they even talk about AI, because like we talked earlier, AI is 80% data, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is one of the gap that like needs to be addressed if a company is looking at implementing AI. But then the other part is, once you have a company that has a lot of data, then it's about like structuring the data, labeling data, all that stuff, which I know like Peggy, probably you're more an expert in that than me. Assuming you have all the data you need, and then it's about really the ethics of AI before you even design a project. I feel like that needs to be put into the whole like design process of an AI project, and it's the first thing that you need to do is using, and there's so many tools out there right now, and even we have one called AI Readiness Planner to make sure you're ready to start your AI planning. Look at like who should be the approvers, who should be accountable for, what data should be used, because certainly there's a lot of companies using public data that they shouldn't be using when they're building AI models.
I see.
So there's a lot of like ethical issues that needs to be dealt with before you start an AI project. And because there's also a lot of push from ESG right now across many different industries. ESG is environmental, social and governance. Principles. Yeah. ESG.
Is it an industry body or is it a government body? What is that?
I guess that is just a principle that like companies are adopting. Like BlackRock, for example, require all their funds to be ESG compliant by 2023, right? There's a lot that I think, again, it's back to Black Lives Matter and even Me Too movements. A lot of companies are now looking back, how do we like be good to not just our shareholders, but also, our employees, the society, the environment. So all that push is like putting AI ethics in the forefront. So AI ethics, AI governance should be the start of every AI project, is what I would say.
That's good. Actually, yeah, that gives us a very good blueprint to start with.
Yeah.
So another area from a trends perspective, right? So we talked about the data being 80%. We talked about the model market, some market for models that's also evolving. And the other thing that you also mentioned is this whole ML ops, right? So productizing the AI itself is a very nascent stage, right? So taking it from POC projects and pilot into production itself is taking more time as well. So the question I have for you is, it goes to the heart of Fairly AI, in my opinion. So fundamentally, organizations are profit oriented, right? I mean, I would say in general, right? So it's about creating customers, it's making profit. And this whole governance aspect, right, especially AI governance, does it stand in the way of companies saying that I want to maximize my profit, and then this is something that I have to deal with, and so I'll just deal with it only from that angle? Because each organization deals with this problem in different ways. Some of them are really proactive, like IBM killed the facial recognition because of the social goodness. But some other company said, I will try to use it to have a competitive differentiation with me and other companies, right? So how can you normalize this behavior of companies to maximize the profits, but making sure that AI is not being used for for nefarious purposes, for lack of better words?
Yeah, I think unfortunately you're right. There's certainly companies we've talked to is like, yeah, there's bias in my data, but so what? Like, it's very unfortunate. So like we are definitely coming at it from the regulatory angle, governance, risk, and control. Mm-hmm. So there's certainly like reputational risk involved if like, you push out an AI algorithm that has, that prefer men for all tech jobs, like Amazon tried to do, but they actually did scrap that. They found out. So like I would say reputational harm is one of the main thing that we can try to push on. But ultimately, it is going to be regulations. Unfortunately, we cannot rely on companies to self-regulate. I think IBM's CEO agree with that. He actually came out and said, yeah, he support regulations. And then a few other tech leaders also said the same thing. So I think we are definitely seeing more AI regulations coming.
Mhm.
And at that point, I think is where we will see the tipping point, I would say, for like adoption into AI governance. And because a lot of startups we talk to right now, like really they should be the one looking at AI governance and AI ethic issue. I probably David touched upon in his podcast, that like data scientists, especially in the startup area, like are making some real ethical decisions.
Yeah.
And there's no oversight.
There's no
But at the same
oversight.
time, yeah,
That's a
they're
concern.
busy building a business, and like, that all get pushed to the back burner. Ethics and governance get all pushed to the back burner.
Improving accuracy, making it better, getting the results, right? So just got to show something to the management, who cares about ethics, yeah.
I mean, we've certainly heard like investors are now also demanding that, if they invest in an AI company, they make sure that they do the like various bias check and all that stuff. But I don't know how like anyone is actually enforcing that, or how many people are actually doing that. But
yeah,
it's
But
coming.
perhaps even ultimately before they can go to market, I think maybe their customers, I think people should demand ethics and fairness. But I think we're far away from that type of tipping point to normalize it. So, but thank you so much, Fionn, for your comments, for your time today. I know that I have learned a lot more about your company and the origins and really where it fits into the whole space of AI. So really appreciate your time today, Fionn.
Thank you so much.
and thank you
Thanks
very
very
much.
much.
Really, really appreciate it. So yeah, so we've learned a lot, and not only that, about the company, about you as a person as well, and then what drives you.
Thank you. This was fun. We'll do it again sometime.
Definitely.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard today and would like to hear more, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite player like iTunes and Spotify. And please do rate our podcast. Also, please go to our website, www.datatransformerspodcast.com, for more episodes, blogs, and information on our speakers. Thank you.